So for the last few weeks, we have been concentrating from Easter on the events that happened at Easter, and we looked at the resurrection, and we've looked at how the Lord came and he spoke to various different people in his resurrected body, and then we looked at the fact that the Lord, after those 40 days, went back up to be with his to be back in heaven, and he left the disciples with the charge of going into all the world to preach the gospel. And we looked a little bit, didn't we, at the day of Pentecost, and we thought about how the church was established and how it started in that day. And then we looked last week at the conversion of Paul, this critical figure in the early church. Once the message had spread from the Jews and had been in Judea, and it was moving out into Samaria, and of course Peter, he then is the first one that speaks to the Gentiles, and Cornelius is saved, and Paul is or Saul at the time is then is converted, and his main task, as the Lord gives him, was to take the gospel out to the Gentiles. And a lot of Acts, as we know, records the journeys that Paul has. The second half of Acts records the journeys that Paul has. And what we're going to think about really this evening was under the title of "They Turn the World Upside Down." And the verses which we're going to look at and just concentrate on are found in Acts chapter 17. What I want to do just for a little while this evening is just to think about the work of the spread of the gospel through Paul and through his contemporaries, and just to think a little bit about what happened to the point that people have said, at least in the version that I'm going to read, they've turned the world upside down. So I'd like to, if you've got a Bible and you want to follow, to read Acts chapter 17, and we're going to read the first 9 verses. And this is the little bit of the journey that Paul is in, where he visits Thessalonica. So Acts chapter 17, verse 1 says, "Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Then Paul, as his custom was, went into them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, 'This Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ.' And some of them were persuaded, and a great multitude of devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women joined Paul and Silas. But the Jews who were not persuaded, becoming envious, took some of the evil men from the marketplace, and gathering a mob, set all the city in an uproar and attacked the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some brethren to the rulers of the city, crying out, 'These who have turned the world upside down have come here too. Jason has harbored them, and these are all acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying, there is another king, Jesus.' And they troubled the crowd and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. And so when they had taken security from Jason and the rest, they let them go." And we'll just leave the word there, and we'll look to God that he will just bless us as we think about those verses. And in fact, in a sense, we're going to look a little bit wider than just the verses that we find in 1 Thessalonians and chapter 17. The little section we have here, in a way, gives us a sort of an example of a typical example of what Paul encountered as he went from place to place. And from the first missionary journey, which was in Acts chapter 13, and then the second missionary journey, which was at the end of Acts chapter 15, moving into chapter 16, and where he currently is in Acts chapter 17, and even going beyond that into his future missionary journeys which he would have. And what we find is that Paul encounters a similar kind of situation everywhere he goes, and I want us to use that as a basis to encourage us and to think about what happened as the gospel started to spread, and as it started to move with those who took it into the different towns and the cities in the regions around beyond Samaria into the uttermost parts of the world. And so I want us to start actually with the verse that that was kind of towards the end of the passage there, which was in verse 6, the cry that the people gave. I want us to think as we start there, which was the critical part, if you like, of this conclusion that people had come to. And then we'll have a think about why this trouble was caused and how it was caused, and hopefully we'll get some lessons from it. So in verse 6, it says that the people, they came out and they said that they have turned the world upside down, and they've come here as well. They've come to Thessalonica. And this is the accusation, if you like, that Paul is met with. He's met with this accusation that he has been responsible for turning the people's world, or the world, upside down, or the known world, I suppose, at the time. Now, the word itself is an interesting little word. It's not used very often. It's only used 3 times in the New Testament. And it, in a sense, it really just means to agitate, or to incite a riot, cause a riot. And one of its other uses is found in Acts chapter 21. And somebody confused Paul for being an Egyptian. Quite how they did that, I don't know, but they thought he was an Egyptian who had stirred up, incited and agitated the people with a following of about 4,000 people, and took them out into the desert. And it's the same word there that's used. It's this little word here that he is supposedly have been one to agitate, one to cause a bit of an uproar, cause a stir. Really, I suppose, in a sense, it's somebody that causes trouble. And the conclusion, if you like, that people had come to when they thought about what Paul was doing and what he was saying and what they had heard, and obviously the word had come through to them at Thessalonica, what this man was like, what Paul was like, and his followers, and they were, in their eyes, somebody who was stirring up trouble, somebody who was creating an issue, and they were agitating the people. And this is what the gospel message had done. It had got to a point where it was agitating, it was creating a stir, it was causing a problem to those who were having to think about it. And so, in the sense that we read the world had been turned upside down, is a good way perhaps of describing it, to think about the fact that in terms of what the gospel message was doing, was it was making people think outside of what they were comfortable with. It was making people reassess and reevaluate what they had been taught, what they thought was right and what they thought was true. And of course, we have that exactly today, don't we? And when we present the gospel to people, then this is something new, and it's something different, and it's something which stirs them up. It's something that maybe agitates them. It's something that, if you like, would turn their world upside down. It turns their thinking upside down. It makes them start to reevaluate the things that they thought were true. And if we think back to the last couple of weeks on a Thursday, with the various videos that we've watched and the conversations that we maybe have had in relation to science and the Bible, and that's exactly the thing, isn't it? Where those that we thought of that are atheists or agnostics, that when they're challenged about the norm or the status quo, then maybe the things that they thought were true, that they thought were right, are causing them to think and to be concerned whether they actually know the truth or not. And one of the things that the gospel has to do and will do is exactly that in people. If it doesn't make people think, and it doesn't stop them from doing the things that they're currently doing or going the way that they're going, then it can't be the gospel, can it? Because the gospel is alien to the normal human natural way of doing things, which is those who have gone away from God, and mankind which has gone its own way. And so the gospel message, that message of salvation, that message which preaches Christ crucified, that introduces the idea of accountability to a holy God, that introduces the idea of sin and the need for forgiveness and the qualities of grace and love and mercy that can only come from God, those things are not natural and they're not normal for us as a human race to want to consider or to put into our lives. And we'd rather have lives where we had no accountability, where we could do what we wanted, where our free will was our free will to do whatever we like, so that we might just live as we want. Perhaps even to the point where we convince ourselves that there's nothing after life and that we can do as we please and then it's all over and we're done for. And there's nothing that we need to be worried about or concerned about in terms of having to answer for the actions that we have done. And yet the gospel comes in and it makes a totally different viewpoint, doesn't it? And it says, no, you are accountable. There is a God. There's a God who created you. You're made in his image. There are truths by which he would expect you and I to live by. And if we don't, then we have to stand before him in a day to come and to answer to that. And on top of that, the fact that our sins need to be dealt with, that they, of course, themselves are something that we need to come to God through Christ and his work. And so the whole matter of what the gospel is would naturally have caused, if it's preached right and it's preached well, then it would naturally cause men to be agitated and to be stirred up in their mind, and perhaps physically, as it was in this case, that their whole world is being turned upside down. And that's what happened. That is what is going on, that as the gospel starts to spread through the world, and as Paul meets Jews and Gentiles in town after town after town, we find that he is presenting the same message and he is getting the same response back. And he is getting the same effect, where there are those who do accept and there are those that don't. And we'll come on to think about that a bit more. And so let us think a little bit more, in a bit more detail, shall we, about what it is that causes these people to really get themselves so agitated and to think that the gospel is such a different thing and it's causing the world to be turned upside down in their view. And so we'll kind of trace back through the verses, shall we, and look down at what's been going on. What I want to think with you, perhaps first of all, is as we move into it, is how does Paul cause this issue, I suppose? What is it that Paul does? And maybe we get some lessons about how we might ourselves be transmitting the gospel message and sharing our faith as we have opportunity. And so I want to do that by thinking about some of the key words that are used in Acts chapter 17, when Paul is in Thessalonica, and just think about some of the things which he does, which is a way in which he presents the message. And so if we start in verse 1 of chapter 17, we find first of all that he passes through two places, Amphipolis and Apollonia, and it just simply says that they pass through until they come to a place called Thessalonica. And the key, it seems here, for the reason for stopping, is that there was a synagogue of the Jews. Now, whether these two previous places didn't have synagogues, we're not told, but one assumes that had there been a synagogue, Paul may well have stopped there. It doesn't seem any particularly logical reason why he would have chosen Thessalonica and missed other places. But in his leading by the Spirit, he is looking for a place where he can go to, which is a synagogue. And one of the things which Paul always seemed to do was, whenever he found a place to start preaching, was he would always go to the synagogue. He would always start at the Jews. He would always start where there was a Jewish community which he could go and speak to, and he could reason and discuss and speak about. And it seems as though that was the way that they felt as the early church to proceed. That in the same way that the commission was given in Acts chapter 1, that they would start in Jerusalem and they would start with the Jews and they would move out to Samaria and they would go out to the uttermost parts of the world. It seems as though locally that almost seemed like the case as well, that they would start with the Jews, and then whoever they were, they would go and find a Jewish community. And when they had found a Jewish community, they would speak to that Jewish community about the gospel, because the Jews were most related to the very essence of what the gospel was about. They were the ones who worshipped the true God. They were the ones who the Lord Jesus came through the line of. And so the Jews were most closely linked to the gospel. And so it was the place where they first went. And then, of course, as we find frequently, that it's not just the Jews that accept and reject, but we find that they're often devout or God-fearing, God-worshipping Greeks. And we find those who are sort of loosely connected with the synagogue in some way, and they themselves come on board and hear that message. And then, of course, the message is then usually taken, sadly, through the rejection in the synagogue out to the wider marketplace and to the other places within the towns. And so you find that pattern as you work through from Acts chapter 13, and you work past chapter 17 into chapters 20, 21, 22, and you find that where Paul goes, he goes to the synagogue. And the use of the word synagogue is quite a lot of references to the synagogue within chapters 13 to 20. And in each case, Paul comes to a place, and then he goes into the synagogue, and he speaks to the Jews there. And so he stops at Thessalonica because there's a synagogue, and it says, as his custom was. This was something which was normal. This was the thing which he did, and I've just alluded to that. If you look back, you'll find that he did that in the various places which he went to. He stopped at Antioch in Pisidia. He stopped at Corinth. He stopped at Athens. He went each time where he went into the synagogue. It was his custom. It was the norm for him to do. And what we find is he goes there for 3 Sabbaths. He doesn't just drop off, give a message, and then do a runner, I suppose. What he does is he stops and he takes the time for as long as it takes in order to discuss and to talk through and to speak and to reason the gospel message with the Jews that are there. And in this particular case, it was for 3 weeks, for 3 Sabbaths. And he goes in and he speaks. Now, presumably through the week, he would have had further conversations with different people, but he is brought back following Sabbath, and he explains the gospel, and he talks through the various things which were, in essence, what the gospel message is. And he does that for 3 Sabbaths. And I suppose there's a lesson there, isn't there, in terms of how we will approach our own outreach. Firstly, we can't go everywhere. There has to be some kind of recognition in our own minds where we will go. Paul passes through 2 towns and he settles in Thessalonica. We ourselves have only limited time resources to be able to settle, if you like, in a particular place, in a particular area to witness and to preach. And we find that in the place which we feel we might be led to, the area which we are living within, the community which we have most links to, those kind of things that we might find us when we are looking for how do we preach, how do we share our faith, who do we share our faith with. We don't do nothing because there are just too many places to go. We perhaps have to be a little bit more strategic, and Paul seems to be, at least in some sense, strategic in where he's going. And the second thing, of course, is that he doesn't just give it one quick fire and then he's off again. He keeps coming back until he knows it's right in order to leave. And when we read the whole story, we find that 3 Sabbaths in this case is as much as the people can manage before they kick him out and they don't want to have anything to do with him. But he takes the opportunity for as long as he can in order to reason. And I assume that all that time he was engaged in this conversation that he was having. And so he has a custom, he has a way, he has a normal, if you like, approach. And now I want you to think with me, if you would, just that what it says about what he actually does when he's in the Sabbath, because it says he reasoned. I read he reasoned from the scriptures, and it says explaining and demonstrating. So 3 words there: he reasoned, he explained, and he demonstrated. And so I suppose the first word there, which kind of is a general word and more inclusive word about what it is that he came to do. It has a wide use outside of the scriptures. It can mean as much as discussion. It can just mean simply speaking, just talking through. But that idea of discussion and having some kind of two-way conversation, probably, it's less of a lecture, but more of as one sense, I suppose, of reasoning, being able to go through in a logical sort of manner and being able to work through the different questions and important points that are that would come up from others and that you would want to present. And so Paul, he takes a clear and a logical approach to just explaining the gospel, to explain why this message was important, why they needed, as Jews, to think differently to what they were thinking before, why they needed to take their Old Testament and they needed to relook, and they needed to once again think about what it is that God really wanted them to know and what God had already done, and done in particular through his son Jesus. And so Paul, he simply takes that opportunity to discuss and to speak and to talk through the gospel message. And that is what it says he comes to do each of the Sabbaths. He comes to reason and notice from the scriptures. It's not his own ideas. He is, with the Jews in particular, he's taking what they know and he is being able to apply what they currently understand from their scriptures and being able to explain to them that these are God's words and God has a message for them which they've missed, that is hidden in there, that they should understand. Now, that might not be appropriate for all the people we meet. The knowledge of the Bible these days is pretty negligible by maybe most of the people that we meet. But we do need to approach them in a way which is both honest and true to the scriptures, but at the same time relevant and understandable to them in their context and in their knowledge. And so that would mean, of course, that we would have to speak to them on a basis that they would understand, quoting lots of Old Testament passages and telling them all about the sacrifices and the tabernacle and going through the temple, and the whole of that isn't going to make much sense, I suppose, to lots of people, but it would have done to the Jews. And so Paul reasons from the scriptures. Now, we need to reason from the scriptures, the New Testament scriptures. We need to introduce the spiritual, scriptural concepts that God has about the gospel message, but we need to make it relevant and understandable to the people that we speak to. So we need to know where they come from. And we talked about this when we looked at the evangelism course, didn't we? And so he reasons, and he does that with two things. He says explaining and demonstrating. And this little word explaining, it's a really interesting word. And there are some lovely parallels with this particular this verse and Luke 24, where the Lord is on the road to Emmaus. Now, the word quite literally means just to open up, just to open. And the idea of explaining something, of course, when you explain something to somebody, you open it up to them so they can see it and so they can understand what it is that you're getting at. And that's exactly what the Lord did when he was on the road to Emmaus. And in two places, the same word is used. Firstly, physically, their eyes were opened and they saw the Lord when he was breaking the bread in front of them. And then, of course, the Lord disappeared out of their sight. But then in the very next verse, it says, when they talked about it and they said, didn't our hearts burn within us as he opened up the scriptures, as he explained and helped them understand. And of course, the very thing that the Lord Jesus did on the road to Emmaus was to tell these two disciples how that the Christ must needs suffer and to die and to rise into his glory. And so the very message that the Lord himself spoke to the two on the road to Emmaus, as he opened their eyes, as he opened their minds and their understanding, as he explained these things, the very thing that Paul is doing here. He's explaining the fact that Christ had to suffer, and he's explaining and he's opening their mind to the fact that the Christ had to rise again from the dead. And of course, the other thing which he is explaining to them is that the very one that they're looking for is the one that had already come, which was Jesus Christ himself. And so this lovely little example here that we get from Paul is that his method of reasoning and his method of speaking is to open their mind, is to reveal to them and to show them that the gospel, that actually what they already have as their scriptures, has something in it far richer and far more beautiful, and actually something which they hadn't quite seen, which is that the Christ that they were looking for, this all-powerful one that was going to come and reign and going to rescue them, actually he had to come and die, and he had to come and suffer. And maybe they might have turned to the examples of the sacrifices and how the lamb and the Passover had to die, or the sacrifices that were brought, each one, its blood was shed and its offering was given. And they might have looked at various different examples of how God needed sin to be dealt with by the death of an innocent one. And this, of course, would lead Paul into being able to say that the Christ, when he came, he would have to suffer, he would have to die. But at the same time, he could turn to the Psalms and he could say, for example, he wouldn't leave his Holy One to see corruption, that in reference to the resurrection, that he could explain that it was so necessary that the Christ not only would come and die, but he would also rise again. And this was something which would have to agitate their mind, because this was not something that they as Jews were used to seeing in their scriptures. And as we speak to others, we might not be opening up, if you like, the Old Testament to them, because that might be an alien portion. But we might be opening up their mind to the likes of evolution and creation. That we might be opening up their mind to consider the fact that there is accountability, that there is a need for justice, there is a need for holiness, there is an absolute truth, that relativism isn't something to be living by, and all of these things that we might find with different people that we speak to, that in a sense we are, it says, explaining or opening up their minds to think about how the life that they live, viewed from God's point of view, is different. And so Paul, he explains, and then it says he demonstrates or he proves. And as a mathematician, one of the things which I had to do a lot of, which is proof, and this kind of rigor behind proving something. Well, maybe the word is not so much a proof in a mathematical sense, but the word in its active sense is just to place before somebody, to be able to show to somebody that this must be the right thing to believe and the right thing to look at. And so the idea that you're pointing out something to somebody, that for the Jews who had never seen that the Christ needed to suffer, they'd never understood the Old Testament scriptures to be such as they are. And so he was proving to them, he was just pointing out to them that this is what it says and this is what it must mean. And so he knew his audience, and he knew the message, and so he was taking the time to demonstrate or to prove, to point out and to put before the people the essence of the gospel message in a way that they could latch onto and to understand and accept. And you'll note, and we've already mentioned this, that there are two key things that he brings to the Jews. Those two things are, number one, that they had to realign their understanding of what the Christ was going to be like. They had to firstly acknowledge that God's Christ, his Messiah, would suffer and die and would rise again. Until they got that bit, then they couldn't really proceed any further, in a sense. And Paul had to go through that example and explanation with them. But the second thing was, having established that there would be a Messiah who would die, and that there would be one who would come and not only die, but because he was God himself, the Messiah, the Christ, that he would rise again. And then the second point, of course, is to help them understand that Jesus was in fact the very one who was the Christ, and the examples that he gives and his life and his demonstration of his perfection and his miracles and all the things that he did, and his resurrection as a proof of his deity, is something that he then that Paul then goes on to speak. So he has a twofold approach to the Jews here, which is one, to understand their scriptures properly, and then secondly, to make them understand that Jesus was in fact the very Christ that they were looking for. And we must have something similar, because wherever we are approaching others with the gospel and sharing our faith, there are different aspects to which we are trying to help them understand their own view on life. And then once they can get a truer sense of what life is really about from God's point of view, then they can start to understand and accept why Jesus was important, and why Jesus's death was important, and why he needed to die, and why he had to rise again. And so there's a twofold approach perhaps as well. And sometimes either of those sections may take longer than the other, depending on the individual we're speaking to. But perhaps a helpful way of thinking about the fact that when we're preaching and when we're teaching and when we're trying to encourage others to come to Christ, then we need to look at their own point of view first, because until it's a bit more aligned to God's point of view, then they're not going to ever see the need for why Jesus would have died and why he would rise again. And so that was what he was saying, and that's how he said it. And hopefully we can be encouraged to be a little bit like that. And you can see this basic idea that comes through in the way that Paul approaches each time he goes into the synagogue and where he speaks to others. And you'll notice then that what happens is that some were persuaded. It says that some were persuaded, or they listened to Paul, and they followed him. They believed him. They understood what he was saying, that it made sense. And so through the Spirit of God, of course, we would note that they then had an internal change, that they would then believe what Paul was saying, and they could see from the scriptures, and they could see what Paul was saying made sense, and so they accepted it and they followed. They were persuaded by it. But notice that what they also do is they then follow. They joined. It said they joined with them, and they joined Paul and they joined Silas, and they joined this little group of Christians. And that was a very obvious step, wasn't it? Where they went from being part of the synagogue to being part of this Christian community. And it became very noticeable that they would have, the people would have seen, and the Jewish leaders would have seen these people moving from one group, if you like, to another. That they aligned themselves with Paul and Silas and with their teaching, and they accepted what they were saying, and they believed it. They joined in their company. And it was that really created the issue, I think. What you find is that there were some Jews, there were many devout Greeks, and there were not a few leading women. So in verse 4, we find a little snapshot of what happened, that the gospel was effective. The message found a place in the hearts and minds of those around. There were some Jews. Then there were these devout Greeks. It calls them devout Greeks. There were God-worshipping Greeks. They were those who had an understanding and were following God in some way. And now, of course, Paul had explained and opened their eyes to what it really meant to worship God. And so they come wholeheartedly and accept the teaching that Paul gives, as he gives about the fact that to worship God in spirit and in truth means coming and accepting Christ as their Saviour, acknowledging all the things that salvation expects. And of course, there are these leading women as well. And so there's this group of people that have joined themselves to Paul and Silas. And the thing that then creates the issue is that there is jealousy. And I thought this was a bit strange, because I would not necessarily have expected jealousy to be the reason why they then sort of proceeded with this strange attack on Paul. But that's what happened. And it might well be that when we find that others come to Christ, that there are those around them who are jealous. Maybe they recognize that they have no real hold because what they believe and what they hold to is in one sense nonsense, or is not logical, doesn't make any sense. And so the reaction of the Jewish leaders is to be jealous. They were jealous of Paul and Silas because they had a message which was real and it was true, and it was causing a difference in people. And it was making people understand for the first time that, for the Jews' point of view, the whole of the Old Testament, they could start to see what the plan of God was in relation to his salvation through the ages. And so they become envious, and it might well be that we need to be aware of that when we see fruit and we see God blessing, that there will be those around us who are envious, and that envy can take hold in or can be seen in lots of different ways. And the way it's seen here is this: that these Jews, who, let's face it, are supposed to be the very ones who are closest to God, they truly believed that they understood God and that they had God's word and they knew everything about God. And yet it says they're the ones who go and find evil men from the marketplace, and they get a mob together and they do everything which is seemingly anti-Jewish and very anti-God, and they create this uproar and they create a riot itself, because they are they are the ones that have actually become agitated and have made a big stir, and they end up doing this whole big thing, and accuse Paul and the other Christians, as they think back to what had taken place, that the whole world had been turned upside down. And so it is with the gospel, that if we preach the gospel and if we discuss and teach the gospel in this way, when we see the Lord moving and we see God blessing, then inevitably there will be some opposition, and that opposition will come in various forms. In this particular case, it came from jealousy from the Jewish leaders, and that actually was often the case with Paul, and he knew that every time he went to the synagogue he was going to be rejected, and then some kind of trouble would be stirred up, and he would be used to that. And but it didn't stop him. It meant that he kept going. He went on to the next town, and he went on to the next town, and he did the same thing. And he did it because, regardless of what happened to him, he knew that there were some Jews that would be converted, and that there would be many, perhaps others, who would come to know that Christ, and there would be churches established, and there would be believers who would be able to serve the true God. And so the encouragement to us is to be like Paul, that when we are able to share our faith and to be able to spend that time to be like Paul, that we might well, and we will do, come against some kind of opposition, is to be encouraged that when God is blessing, and we will see that blessing, that although opposition may come, that there's a great work, an eternal work done, which God has chosen you and me to be part of, which we can of course be thankful. And so those are my thoughts this evening for you. I trust there'll be an encouragement to you as you just think about Paul, about his preaching, his manner, which got the label of being the one who was responsible for turning the world upside down. And maybe in our own communities and in our own areas and our own families, wherever they might be, or even in bigger spheres, we might find that we are the ones who are described as those who have turned the world upside down, because we've made people think about their need for God, their need for salvation, his salvation through Jesus Christ. So I do trust it's been an encouragement, and let us just finish with a brief word of prayer.